Hi folks, it's Dr. Rob CYWES. I'm the Carb Addiction Doc, and before we get into today's video, I just want to say thank you so much to folks that throw us a few dollars at our Patreon account and especially at our PayPal account. The addresses are in the show notes below, but that keeps this channel free. You can help us by subscribing to this channel and by liking the videos or even leaving a comment. And if you see some of our videos popping up on your feed, click on it for a few seconds. Thanks so much, and now to today's video. Hi folks, this is Dr. Rob CYWES. I am the Carb Addiction Doc, and we're taping a series of videos on how to start and the important aspects of a carnivore diet that may differ from some of the gum-flapping influences out there. Today we're going to talk about the underlying biology of how to revamp and reset the hormonal cycling in the human body and why it's important. One of the values of a pure carnivore diet is that it is the most rapid, most anti-inflammatory diet, but it's the most rapid diet to get rid of insulin resistance and establish a state of insulin sensitivity. Now, what does insulin sensitivity really mean? Okay, directly, specifically, it means that you need very little insulin to get sugar into your cells, that the cells are desiring a small amount of sugar and that very little insulin gets it in there, because when those cells desire sugar, they will ramp up the number of insulin receptors for cells that use insulin receptors to get the sugar into the cells. So insulin sensitivity is about having a high number of switched on insulin receptors where a very small amount of insulin in your bloodstream is adequate because of that number of receptors, where there are more receptors than insulin, to get that sugar into the cells. And two things. First of all, that sugar gets very easily into the cells. But secondly, that you need very little sugar in your cells because they have an alternative fuel source, which is the healthiest fuel source for most cells, which is ketones and non-esterified fatty acids that enter the cell independent of the requirement of insulin. So we're talking about rapid entry of sugar into cells where the intracellular sugar and your blood sugar are about the same level with a slight gradient, maybe even an uphill gradient, and that the flux of sugar through your blood system is very slow and very flat. In other words, how much sugar the cells of your body extract and how much your liver has to replenish to re-release into the bloodstream is as low as possible, okay? So those are two factors called insulin sensitivity, and insulin sensitivity is the holy grail. And as eating human beings, we go through 3 cycles, and the objective here is on a daily basis, in a very tidal way, to cycle through all 3 phases. So when you establish a carnivore diet, it is very important to bear in mind and to measure the 3 phases of hormonal cycling and drive your carnivore diet by eating pattern to restore these 3 cycles. So let's talk about them. The first cycle is what I call storage phase. Whenever we eat, and remember, and this is a crucial thing that people forget about, and yet the world out there tells us about this all the time, never judge food as being healthy or unhealthy by what enters your mouth. Because what enters your mouth is not necessarily what's going to go into your bloodstream. Okay? What enters your mouth is a complex food. And it's usually, well, for us, it's a complete animal product. It's a steak, which is the muscles of animals. It's a micronutrient. It's an egg. But that's what's going in our mouth. The intestine enzymatically will break that down into its individual building blocks. Long-chain fatty acids will enter the lymphatic system in the chylomicrons, and the lymphatic system will deliver the majority of your long-chain fatty acids directly to your fat cells for storage. So during and shortly after eating, all the fat bypasses the liver and goes straight to the fat cells for storage. That's a very important concept to understand. And as those fat cells take up fat, even in the brain, that switches off our eating. So that regulatory mechanism is your satiety regulatory mechanism, where the belly and the fat cells are telling the brain, yo, you're full, stop eating. And that's one of the beauties of carnivore, is it lessens the amount we eat if you don't override that. So that's the value of fat. Some of the shorter chain fatty acids and ketones go straight to the liver. All the other nutrients will be broken down into simple amino acids, and there's 20 or 21 amino acids in meat, and meat contains all of those. You cannot duplicate that from vegetarian proteins or vegetable proteins. And the second thing we do is we break down the carbohydrates to simple sugars. Glucose, galactose, and fructose are the three simple sugars. And then there's a variety of micronutrients, fat soluble and liquid, that all traffic up the portal vein. So 100% or close to 100% of those foods, except maybe the fat soluble vitamins that go together with the fat and the lymphatics, the rest travel through a single vessel called the portal vein, and the portal vein travels through the sinusoids of the liver. So the liver is the recipient of all the basic building blocks that the gut has broken your food down into. Crucial to remember. Now, under the influence of insulin, testosterone, human growth hormone, and thyroid hormone free T3, those are the four dominant hormones. There are a few minor players that become elevated during a meal. And one of the hormones responsible for the pre-release of those four storage hormones is GLP-1 and the incretin hormones that occur in the upper intestine. Everyone knows GLP-1 because it's Ozempic, but GLP-1 occurs naturally in the gut, and GLP-1 helps to switch on your storage hormones and switch off your utilization hormones. Come to that in a second. So we want those switched on by the food we're eating. Those hormones rise up as food is getting into the basic building blocks are going to the liver. Under the influence of insulin, insulin will take sugar that we've eaten and store it as glycogen in the liver. The sugar that gets into our bloodstream, and yes, on a carnivore diet, there is a small degree of sugar coming mostly from protein, but that sugar is then stored as glycogen in the muscles, which is the largest repository for stored sugar. But that requires insulin. So your insulin hormone is there. Under the influence of insulin and thyroid hormone T3, we now are producing cholesterol, because cholesterol is an essential product for the cells. But we're producing cholesterol and then storing that cholesterol in our fat cells. Think that one through. We're storing cholesterol in our fat cells. So we're producing it during storage phase, storing our fat cells. We are turning some of the products we eat, particularly protein, into new protein. So we're taking those amino acids, turning them into new protein, which then gets shipped to the muscles or acts as enzymes or hormones, or blood transport molecules like globulins and like albumin, but we're producing protein in the liver under the influence of testosterone, human growth hormone, and insulin and thyroid hormone. We're also converting a small amount of that to sugar, which we call triglycerides. The liver turns sugar, whether the source is protein or sugar we've eaten, into triglycerides, and the liver under these storage conditions produces VLDL, very low density lipoprotein, which is a transport vehicle for fat. Why is that important? Well, the cholesterol that's being produced, the triglycerides that are going to be produced, the phospholipids that the liver is producing, all of these lipid moieties that the liver is producing during storage phase get packaged into VLDL, and then that VLDL gets shipped out, big, full, fluffy VLDL, getting shipped out to the fat cells where it dumps its load for storage. So we've got big, fat, fluffy VLDL, we've got big, fluffy, fat chylomicrons dumping fat in the fat cells, and then the chylomicrons are coming back to the liver and being reprocessed and reforming bile. The VLDL, when it undocks, is small, dense LDL. So yes, we do produce a small amount of small, dense LDLs, the so-called bad LDL, during storage phase. Remember that, okay? So under storage phase, we are distributing and reprocessing nutrients for storage. So the cells of the body are net recipients of an overload of nutrients and of energy. Hi folks, this is Dr. Rob CYWES. I'm the Carb Addiction Doc, and I'm currently training for a half marathon. And typically either on a Saturday or Sunday, I'll do my long run. Now my long runs are at a very slow pace, but they usually are between 60 and 80 minutes, sometimes as high as 2 hours of running. And one of the things I know about my body is that typically around the 8-9 mile mark, I tend to see a massive spike in my blood sugar. I run fasted. I always run fasted, but I wear a CGM and my blood sugars are level, and then they start to spike where I start to run out of energy. My current training schedule between 8 and 9 and 10 miles, depending on what hills here in Florida, not much, I tend to bonk. And what happens is when that blood sugar surges, my performance goes down because my brain's saying, hey, I'm lacking energy. One of the things I've learned to do is to carry one of these little pouches. It's Ketone IQ, but it comes in a gel pack. So it's not a hard thing that I have to drink. I can peel this off. I can suck back on a little bit of this. And I'll usually take 2 of these on my runs. I'll have the first one in the first 10 to 15 minutes if my run is longer than 60 to 80 minutes. And then usually around the 45-minute to an hour mark, I'll hit a second one. And the amazing thing on my CGM is I don't see that massive spike in blood sugar where my brain is struggling. So try this. Take these Ketone IQs with you. If you're running less than 60 minutes, you probably don't need it. But certainly for my long runs on Saturday or Sunday, that's where I tend to use this. And it has changed my glucose and my energy metrics. Now, when you finish your meal and you've gone through that storage phase, and by the way, storage phase can continue from anywhere from 2 to 4 hours after a meal all the way through to 24 hours after a meal, depending on how quickly your stomach emptied and depending on how well your gut and your liver mobilizes and stores those food substances. So storage phase can be very variable, and the objective here is to shorten storage phase. So when it comes to pattern of eating, ideally we do not want you to be in active storage mode, in other words, eating, for more than 6 to 8 hours in any given day. And the shorter that storage phase is, even if you can shorten it to 4 to 6 hours, the longer the distribution and utilization phases. So we're really looking for that 16 to 18 to 23 hours of not eating as the most important phase of your day. And on a carnivore diet, as you initiate it, I would urge everybody to start with 3 meals a day, breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Start with 3 when you begin your carnivore diet, but then rapidly start to assess, based on your day, based on what's happening, which meal you're going to drop. And eventually, as a baseline on a carnivore diet, as terms of pattern, your storage phase, 2 meals a day within a 6 to 8 hour window or shorter. Default option being 1 meal a day. But what's more important for me is the consistency day in and day out by which you eat those 2 meals, because the hormonal cycle of your body is a learned cycle, and if the body can intellectually anticipate when that's going to happen, it'll get ready for that. A bit like when you tell your Tesla where the supercharger is, it preconditions the battery to load better. There is a psychological or a brain component to your gut that understands when you're going to be fed, and the more cyclical that is, the better. Now, obviously, there's going to be days when it's a bit crazy, but the more you can be in storage phase for anywhere from 1 to 6 to 8 hours, and then have a non-storage phase where you're not consuming calories. Don't use that word often, calories, except for pure fat. It's okay to consume pure fat in the other sides because in that 16 to 18 hours of not eating, because it doesn't trigger insulin. Okay, so if you want to put a little MCT oil, or if you want to put a little heavy cream or butter in your coffee and sip on that through the day, I have no problem with that. It keeps you in ketosis, and I would advise for that early on, the so-called bullet coffee, although not quite as much. But a little bit of fat in what you're drinking in the utilization phase will actually get you into ketosis early. Once you're in steady state, you probably don't need that as much. Then you can go to the black coffee, unless you're trying to maintain weight. So those are all little nuances that are individualized. However, storage phase is crucial. Once you've stored and distributed all the food that your body needs, or that you've eaten, and if you overeat, if you panic, I must eat more protein, you stay in storage phase for way too long, and you stress that system, and that system has to burn off more. So if on a carnivore diet your triglycerides are too high, it probably means you're overeating, or you're overeating protein. So we have feedback looking at the blood work numbers to understand that metric. Now, So design a diet where you're eating 1 or 2 meals a day in a 6 to 8 hour window, starting with 3 and reducing that. Once you've gone out of storage phase and you've distributed all the food that you're eating, the cells now switch over. The cells of your body switch over from being absorbers of food to becoming demanding of energy. So the cells now require energy. They can produce some of that internally, but they require energy, so they go into demand phase. And hormonally, what happens is as your storage declines, your insulin, thyroid hormone, testosterone, human growth hormone subsides. Those hormones go down. And slowly, glucagon, which is your utilization hormone, rises. So there's a crossover point. And early on, as glucagon rises, you've still got enough insulin. Insulin switches off the release of fat from the fat cells, switches that off. So early on, insulin is falling, but glucagon is rising, not to a point that you can release fat, but the first thing that glucagon does is 2 things. Number 1, it releases stored glycogen, it releases sugar from the liver and replenishes your blood sugar. Glucagon also will turn certain amino acids, certain protein, into either sugar or ketones. So gluconeogenesis begins to happen and glycolysis, the breakdown of glycogen. So you've got 2 sources of sugar and a little bit of ketones. That's why on a well-formulated carnivore diet, you'll always have low-level ketones because glucagon is going to be producing that as it turns over amino acids. If that amino acid turnover is too high, your triglycerides are going to go up because you're going to store sugar as fat. I know it's complex. But as your insulin falls, you've still got enough insulin. As your cells become insulin sensitive, to shove that sugar released by glucagon into your cells for use as energy now, not for storage. So the first utilization phase is the glucose utilization phase, rising glucagon, falling insulin. And a lot of people never get out of that. Okay? Anytime you eat anything within this period, in the utilization phase, that triggers insulin, you creating hormonal chaos. That's why any little snack, oh, it's just a little snack, oh, it's pepperoni, oh, it's cheese, it's carnivore. It's still creating hormonal chaos. If you're going to do that, have your sip of coffee, either plain coffee or coffee with a little bit of heavy cream that doesn't trigger insulin. Okay? Now, as the glycogen in your liver depletes, and as insulin further falls, there's a threshold by which when glucagon is rising, as insulin falls, you're releasing sugar into the bloodstream, but the sugar gets less and less. And now high glucagon, lower insulin releases the block on fat release from your fat cells, and you are now beginning to release fat from your fat cells, and some of that non-esterified fatty acids is going straight to the cells as a source of fat. Some of it is being transported in LDL as fat back to your liver and out to the cells for dumping in the cells as a source of energy. So now remember, during storage phase, you had big fluffy LDL molecules and big fluffy VLDL and small dense LDL. Now in utilization phase, you are no longer ideally transporting fat in the form of VLDL to your fat cells. So the VLDL becomes empty, the VLDL molecule size goes down, and your VLDL docks with the fat cells, and instead of dumping fat, it is now picking up fat. It's picking up 3 omega fatty acids. It's picking up vitamin D and some of the other fat-soluble vitamins. It's picking up phospholipids. It's picking up cholesterol. And what undocks is a big, fat, fluffy LDL molecule, comes back to the liver and goes to your cells. Of course, that's why on a carnivore diet, your cholesterol ideally should be going up in a good way because you're distributing cholesterol to the cells that need it. Don't be afraid of that, but expect your LDL to rise if you are in a healthy, fat-adapted state. But what's happening now with high glucagon, with low insulin, you are no longer releasing glucose from the liver in the form of glycogen, so there's a little bit left in the liver for the liver's own use and for emergency purposes. But for the most part right now, your blood sugar flux is going down and you are living more on ketones and fat that glucagon is producing in the liver, and then getting into your cells with low levels of insulin. That's why insulin sensitivity is so important. Think about this little factoid, folks. The average human being has about 5 liters of blood in their blood system. And if you look in a fat-adapted, healthy, insulin-sensitive person, the amount of sugar that is, if you narrow it down in those 5 liters of blood, the amount of sugar you need to maintain a normal blood sugar below 95 is between 4 and 4.5 grams of sugar in 5 liters of blood. That is less than a level teaspoon of sugar dissolved in 5 liters of blood. That's how much we're talking about. In fact, if you go from 4 grams to 5 grams or 4.5 grams to 5 grams, that'll lead to type 2 diabetes. That's how little is required. So what we're talking about is glucagon producing and providing that sugar, and glucagon should be the primary provider of sugar, not your mouth. Manufactured and released by the liver, distributing that into the bloodstream, and you will never be hyperglycemic on that unless you demand it through exercise or something like that, which is a normal physiologic response. But think that metric through. And then the issue with blood sugar comes down to how sensitive, insulin sensitive your cells are, when a small amount of insulin can get that sugar into the cells that need it, but the need of those cells is lower. So you don't have that big flux, and glucagon levels are doing this. They're slightly going up with so there's minor variations in glucagon insulin ratio because you're glucagon and insulin sensitive. And the release of sugar into your bloodstream is very slow. And this is very important on carnivore diet because a lot of people on the wrong carnivore diet, especially over time, screw up that ratio. I'll talk about that in a second. But the third phase, once you've distributed that sugar and once your insulin's low and your glucagon is higher, you enter fat utilization phase, which is for most people the healthiest, most important part of the recovery phase from a standard American diet, from insulin resistance. So the objective of a carnivore diet early on is to be in fat utilization phase for the longest, and at first it's your own fat from your own fat cells. Eventually, when you're very lean, it can be fat from your diet that is getting stored and transitioned on a daily basis. But at first, it's access in a prolonged way from your own fat cells. So we want to be in fat utilization phase where insulin is low and glucagon is high or moderately high. And what you're doing there is undergoing autophagy, cellular tissue repair, you're repairing tissue membranes. You are also going through autophagy, breaking down old dead cells, and you are going through the stimulation of mitosis and the creation of new cells with insulin regulation so that you don't form cancer cells. So the healthiest place for a human being to be is in that fat utilization phase for as long as possible. And the first goal of a carnivore diet is to achieve that fat utilization. So when you're considering a carnivore diet, pattern of eating is also crucial. You want to eventually get down to 1 to 2 meals a day in a 4 to 6 hour, 6 to 8 hour window with 16 to 18 hours of not eating, perhaps replenishing some fat as pure fat from your drink, but you want to get into and stay in fat utilization for as long as possible. The other ideal time to exercise to accelerate your way through this is to exercise during the latter part of the glucose utilization phase, where you burn off that sugar. Usually occurs early morning if you're going to eat dinner. Burn off that sugar so that you get into fat utilization early before your next meal. So from a strategic perspective on a carnivore diet, patterning and hormonal cycling through adjusting your meal times is crucial to getting here. Now, one of the last things I'm going to tell you for people that have been on a carnivore diet for a long time, we commonly see people that are fat adapted carnivore, and when we measure their glucagon levels are super high. And we measure glucagon in everybody. Very few people ever do. Normal glucagon for me is around 25 to 35. But I see glucagons in the 80, 90, 100, which is fine. But when your glucagon is high and your insulin is low, that is called insulin suppression. And under that very high levels of glucagon, you are now breaking down your own tissues. You are breaking down your own tissues because of that high glucagon. Typically, you're very lean. You're a lean mass hyperresponder, lean mass. Glucagon's very high, cholesterol's very high because you're releasing all that cholesterol from your fat cells, plus you're absorbing it from the fat in your gut. And that is not necessarily a healthy state of being. So the first part of a carnivore diet is to restore healthy hormonal cycling through brief storage, brief glucose utilization, prolonged fat utilization. But if you're in fat utilization almost all the time with brief periods of storage and glucagon is very high, that is where the pendulum is swung over too far. It's kind of the Paul Saladino effect. And you're going to start to feel miserable on that. And we know that from high glucagon and high cholesterol. While those are not dangerous, they represent a state of being where you swung that pendulum too far, and we need to bring that back to a centrist form. And I'll explain to you how to do that. But we start to see A1Cs rising, we see insulin very low, we see BUNs rising, we see glucagon very high, and we see prolonged deep fat utilization that becomes detrimental. So everything has a bell curve, and you want to get into fat utilization, but you don't want to stay there throughout the course of the day. And we can measure glucagon to determine that. So please understand the value of hormonal cycling on a daily basis. And part of the purpose of a carnivore diet is to get into and maintain those 3 cycles. Now, the next video is going to talk about micronutrients and supplementation on a carnivore diet. I am the Carb Addiction Doc. I know this is sophisticated. I know it's nerding out, but it's so important for those people teaching carnivore as a way of life to understand all of these metrics rather than just knee-jerking to the initial phases.